Welcome to Charts Today. My name's David Linton, and today's edition for Monday, the 2nd of March, comes to you from London. And of course, we had a terrible week in markets last week. I mean, the FTSE 100 in the UK, for example, down 13%. And it was a really big week off the back of coronavirus, and we saw markets fall very heavily. We've seen a lot of central banks over the weekend saying that they would support markets, do whatever it takes, and we are seeing markets bouncing this morning positively on that news. Of course, the big thing this coming week or so will be as we watch the coronavirus news flow coming in from the US and Europe now over and above Asia. It'll be interesting to see how the market copes with that. But for the moment, we're seeing a bit of a bounce. And I guess before I look at the individual markets, it's worth just thinking about what happened here. And this is one of the screens I actually post on Twitter or LinkedIn. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at Charts Today as my handle, or on LinkedIn, just my name. And you'll basically see here, this is this data mostly coming from Yahoo Finance. And here we're looking at the daily screens for the daily cloud for the S&P, the Nasdaq Composite, the Dow, and the Russell 2000, and we can see, bar the Nasdaq Composite, the Nasdaq we're actually holding the lagging line on the cloud, but on the other charts we're through. Now I like to use a 3-day rule. So on the S&P 500 index, for example, with the futures suggesting we're going to open up, we might well just spike back up through this cloud. The Russell 2000 has a lot more work to do, as does the Dow. Looking at Europe, the FTSE is really well and truly through. We're seeing the bounce showing up here this morning. The same with the Eurostock 600. We see that the DAX, the CAC, and the Italian market, of course, all through on the daily clouds. In Japan, the Nikkei's through. It bounced overnight on talk of the Bank of Japan supporting markets. The Hang Seng is through, the Sensex is through, and the Aussie market well and truly through, as is the COPSI, of course. So if we look to the same charts but weekly, this gives us a longer term view. We see here on the US markets, all the major US indices here are holding above their clouds, so they are still in a long-term bullish trend. That's hard for anyone to believe with what's happened, but we are still long-term bullish there. FTSE is through well and truly, so it's got a lot of work to do to turn bullish again. The stocks, European markets, actually all holding up bar the FTSE. The FTSE 100 is the ugly duckling in the European space. Japan just sitting right on the cloud. Of course, we're seeing that response this week. Interesting, the Hang Seng is below, and the COPSI actually never managed to get above. So interestingly, we have got markets that are turning long-term bearish off the back of this, but for the moment, the US markets are holding up. Back to the main screen I look at here. Remember, this is my long-term or the weekly, the 1% point figure chart, the medium term, and this daily, and then the 60-minute charts for the shorter term picture. And so if we look here, we see the dollar index has fallen quite significantly, really came back last week. So we've come back on the dollar, but we're still holding on to long-term bullish on both the medium and long-term charts. But short term we are bearish, and that led to the euro looking stronger against the dollar. So we saw the euro really trending up last week. Japanese yen, we saw dollar yen falling as well, so the dollar was falling against the yen, putting us back into, having been bullish for a while, putting us back into bearish territory. We're interesting to see how we hold that, and the same on the long-term chart. So the yen is seeing that support, and Bank of Japan comments also having an impact there. Sterling turning bearish against the dollar last week on the daily chart. We've never really made it above on the weekly chart. So sterling looking weak, and we've got 3 downside targets there, so it looks like a bad week ahead for the pound, and the same on the euro. We're seeing here as well. Euro sterling also looking weaker then as well. And if we look at Bitcoin sitting at $8,600. It's still looking bullish on the medium and long-term charts, and short-term we look like we're about to make a transition. Of course, we saw the position on the US markets. It's all about the futures this morning. The S&P Mini is up 1.7%. It does suggest a strong opening in Wall Street, and the Nasdaq is up 2%. Again, remembering that NASDAQ chart never turned bearish on the clouds, and we're seeing here on the daily clouds it just hasn't turned bearish, and we're seeing that showing up here on the future, bouncing on the cloud. So tech stocks actually holding on pretty well. Taking a look at the UK market this morning, we're up 2.3%. So market is showing quite a bit of strength, but of course on the backdrop of a 13% fall last week. Look at that weekly candle. It's small respite, really. The mid caps are up 1.5%. Again, in bearish territory, still on the cloud. Maybe finding some support there on the weekly. Interestingly, on the weekly on this FTSE 100, blue chips really not at all bullish. We're seeing mid caps actually holding on to that in the UK. The DAX in Germany, we're up 1% this morning, so no, not massive rises here. And then the CAC Quarante, we're up 1.4%. So we are seeing a bit of a recovery, but it's looking quite muted still in the UK market. We saw Tokyo and the Hang Seng we saw here up 0.6%. That long-term weekly cloud still a worry. Downside targets. Hong Kong is not out of the woods by any stretch. The Chinese market up 3%. It's really been propped up, but we do have these very long-term targets hanging over us. It's been propped up by the authorities in China, but for the moment, it's hard to see China making new highs, certainly above the high that we saw at the start of the year, let alone the high we saw last spring. So China has still got a lot of work to do. That's the Shanghai Composite. Looking at the Sensex, we're up 1% there overnight, and still bearish, of course. That's not enough to change the picture on the medium and short-term charts. We still do have a plethora of long-term upside targets. The Aussie market didn't manage to show a rise overnight, and it's still been hit by the fallout. Of course, Chinese demand a very big factor for Oz. Looking at Brent crude, we're up 3% this morning. We were below $50 on Friday, and WTI up 3%. But we do have these big downside targets into the 30s now for crude oil. So it really does suggest that we might see a real crisis opening up. Long-term downside targets for crude, it doesn't look good long-term, although we might see this week a better recovery. US NatGas went as low as in the 160s. We had targets there. Those were given and met. We're still bearish on all three timeframes there as well. And if we look to gold, gold, of course, has been a big beneficiary in all of this. The long-term chart looking stellar. The medium-term chart looking good. But we have been just short-term bearish, but we have activated this new upside target as a result of all this move. So still looking pretty good for gold, although the short-term picture is just not so good this week. US 10-year, silver also just struggling a little bit there, more the industrial component being a factor there. Looking at US 10-year yields, this was a massive story last week. We absolutely plummeted in the week. We went from 1.5% right down to 1.05%. I mean, unbelievable moves in bond yields. Historic lows. We haven't seen levels like this for decades and decades. I mean, way back to the 1940s, 50s. So really looking very bearish there indeed. And of course, the chart now just very hard to produce any targets because we've just had such a stellar move, but not looking good there. And that's what's had an impact on the dollar, of course. That meant, of course, that German bonds rose. We saw a big move in bond prices last week, and that's the move to safety. Taking a quick look at some other energy products. A lot of our clients are in energy. Just looking at coal. I've put the report out to clients this morning on this. A lot of this OTC prices, of course. Coal still looks very, very bearish indeed. No big surprises there. Carbon markets were also still bearish on that short-term chart. We have met a target here, but very hard to call at the moment. Gas markets, we're seeing UK gas is actually looking more bullish this week, so we're actually looking a little bit better there. And if we look to European gas, Dutch gas being the main contract product, not looking so good there. And of course, power markets have been in the doldrums. German power went below 40 euros for the first time in a very long time on Friday. We're seeing a little bit of recovery this morning, but really it's muted. We do have a new downside target here, and this column here is going to produce a new downside target as well. So looking pretty bearish there across the mix and energy still. Moving just over to stocks now, we saw the Dow on Friday. The worst performer was actually Boeing. They were down 4%. Of course, Boeing's woes have been in the markets for quite some time, but that long-term trend is really clearly breaking. We did see ExxonMobil up and Microsoft. They recovered a little bit on Friday as well. And the Microsoft chart still looks pretty good, long-term bullish. And we just came back to test the cloud with the prices. Apple, of course, being another bellwether, was fairly flat on Friday, and the big one there will be disruption. And they've outperformed the market over the last year by 60%, so still a massive move for Apple. And the Nasdaq, of course, we saw Nasdaq is still holding up pretty well. We had Nvidia up there, up on Friday. So not everything was falling, and looking quite good there. And then in India, just looking to what we've seen overnight in the Indian market, a handful of stocks up, still some pretty big fallers, of course. Yes Bank down a further 8%. Quite a lot of bank stocks down here. Tata Steel, of course, but Yes Bank's been a basket case for some time. Looking now to Europe, this morning we see FTSE, all these prices coming in live from Yahoo Finance. We see here NMC Health. They've been a consistent, strong performer. Well, I say that the chart looks pretty terrible, but they've been in the leaderboard the last few weeks, a few days, and we're seeing that just showing up in the chart. But not much of a position there against the long-term backdrop, of course. We're seeing oil majors up, a lot of relief moves here. Still a handful of stocks down. Airlines still being hit. IAG down a further 6% this morning. EasyJet really has been heavily hit, and we're seeing that they've turned very bearish there. So that's quite key. They've underperformed the Dow by 20% over the last year, and that's really put them into bearish territory. In the FTSE 250 this morning, we see Fresnel, they're up 6%. A lot of relief there on some of these resource stocks. And then on the upside, on the downside, we've got Cineworld down 3.6%. So, and they're just grabbing the data from Yahoo Finance and model downside targets, of course. Euro stocks this morning, the majors in Europe. Schneider Electric, they're up 4.7%. That's a pretty good move, and that chart's still looking pretty good, outperforming the Dow by 32% this year. LVMH, they've been a bit heavily hit on Chinese demand, but they're holding up quite well this morning. On the downside, we don't have many stocks down. Deutsche Post, they're down 6%, so they've been hit. And that chart looking really quite grim, but otherwise we're seeing still some fallout with Motors. BMW here down 0.5% this morning. Geneva Motor Show not going ahead, of course, because of the virus. That's it for today. Until next time, happy charting, stay safe, and keep an eye on these point and figure targets. Until then, see you for now. Bye.